People who saved themselves for marriage and eventually got divorced. What was your approach towards sex after the divorce? In our conservative Lebanese society, after the first divorce, you get a free pass actually. Some people would talk about you, but a lot of conservative people would just tell them she's divorced. This doesn't apply to me, but I do have a friend who is in this boat. His approach has been to swear off relationships and be celibate for the rest of his life. Well, that's one way to handle it, I guess. Mum didn't have sex for 8 years after getting divorced. She's a devoted Christian for sure. Unfortunately. Are you going to be dating your stepbro here soon? This was my wife. We've been divorced for 3 years and I'm pretty sure she hasn't had sex since, and won't until she gets married again. So she's apparently being true to her principles. My scenario was a bit unique in that my ex-husband and I never did the deed in our marriage. After the divorce, I really couldn't wait to lose my V card. I had to suppress my sexuality for so long that my mindset was just to let loose and have some fun. But then I met a really lovely man and we hit it off really well. We're so compatible in many ways, especially in the bedroom, and I have no desire to know what sex would be like with someone else. Should I tell others to wait for marriage? Probably not. But doing it with someone you are deeply in love with is one of the most amazing things in the world, and it's worth waiting for that person to come into your life. Good question. I'm an ex-Mormon and was a virgin when I got married at 21. Was married for over 6 years, had a good, active sex life. And when I got divorced 2 years back, it was a strange new world. I was excited to have sex with new people. But I quickly found after a handful of hookups that it wasn't always that great. There were some exceptions obviously. But I often find that people who haven't been in long-term relationships are pretty lousy in bed. Having a bunch of one-night stands doesn't make you better at IMO. Getting to know someone's body and experimenting does. If I could do it over again, I wouldn't have saved myself for marriage. The best sex I've had has been after my divorce. I have a general rule now that I won't have sex on the first date. I like having more of an emotional connection with the other person. It's more enjoyable that way for me. One of my lifelong friends comes from an extremely Christian family. All 3 kids were taught how bad sex before marriage is. 2 of the 3 ended up with children out of wedlock. My close friend of these siblings saved herself but ended up rushing into marriage with very little self-awareness and found herself in a completely sexually, and otherwise, incompatible marriage. All 3 are divorced at least once now. One has more baby mamas than I can keep track of. After my friend's divorce, she abandoned the no sex before marriage business. She didn't have any wild escapades but developed strong sexual, and otherwise, chemistry with her now husband. Her parents still tried to shame them. It was a cluster to watch over the years. I knew a girl that was very hands-off prior to marriage. I never really thought too much about it until I went to her wedding, and before they kissed the pastor made the announcement that this will be their first kiss, and I was blown away that they have never kissed before. But after their "you may now kiss the bride" kiss, it was obviously their first kiss. The rest of the wedding and reception went well enough, and I heard nothing from them for a few months until someone told me they are getting a divorce. Less than 6 months later. I have a few theories on why. I think the bride is Azul and either never realized it or did not reveal that prior to getting married. She got a bunch of tattoos after the divorce. Full chest ink. Sleeves. But I never heard of her dating after. But we're not close. I, now 38, waited until I was 20. I gave myself to her because I was sure I wanted to wake up next to her for the rest of my life. I felt like we balanced each other for fun and work. We met while I was in college and we worked at a pizza place. She gave me a positive pregnancy test for Christmas and I was happy as hell. After getting married, she seemed to be focused on money and comparing our lives to others. It ended soon after. I got my bachelor's and continue to make good money. But the grass was always greener elsewhere to her. Everyone told me after the divorce I just needed to get laid to get over her. Sex to me was and is still special. I have only experienced it between myself and 3 others. I feel that it is more meaningful when that trust and love is earned. I kinda fit this. I was only with one person voluntarily and was date-paid by the next man before I got married. I was a lonely fool and married my ex after only 3 weeks of dating. Of course I got pregnant right away. The next 20 years were full of abuse of every imaginable type. I won't go into it here. Check my post history if you're that curious. After my husband tried to kill me. He went to prison and I divorced him immediately. The last 6 years I've been with a wonderful, adventurous partner and I've done everything I've ever wanted to try with him. I've had more sex with him in 6 years than I did with my ex in 20 years. Plus, not being paid is nice. My first mate and I, though, didn't wait till marriage. We did not have sex with anyone else till each other. We are on the road to divorce, paperwork tomorrow. She's had sex since the breakup. And I have not. It's been almost a year. For me, the physical and emotional are tied closely to each other. I haven't yet found someone I have the emotional connection with in order to have the equal physical connection. I'm not saving myself for marriage, however. I've been called prude, old-fashioned, naive, etc. for being unable to act physically without the emotions to drive it. I've even hurt people by refusing sex, communication about how you and others work, what your boundaries are and why, as well as expectations are key in any relationship. My suggestion: take the time during the divorce to learn who you are, what you want, what you don't want, and don't listen to other people's expectations or guidance on the sex you should or should not be having. Do what is right for you. Do it purposefully. Do it consciously. Do it wholeheartedly. And of course, do it with consent. My brother and his wife didn't have sex before getting married. Religious upbringing at both ends. Their marriage has been a bit of a disaster. While they are still married and have a kid, they are separated. They didn't really work from day one. It wasn't the lack of sex beforehand that is the reason for it, but more so the fact they never lived together before marriage. The two really go hand in hand when you think about it. Overnight they went from basically dating to living together. Given the problems they had, it was clear they simply did not know one another. My brother always tells me that he wishes they lived together before. Not so much that he wishes they had sex before marriage. I think that the living together bit is what can undo a lot of no sex before marriage couples. My aunt got married at 17 in Mexico to a 20-year, very common. They had 2 kids, sex. Then he cheated on her and left to California. She's been stuck with the 2 kids in Wisconsin ever since. Probably triggers her repressed negative emotions. I grew up Mormon and most of my extended family is Mormon. I stopped when I was still in high school. My cousin got married while still in high school when he and his GF were 18. I vividly recall my aunt very passive-aggressively talking about how great it was that they were saving themselves for marriage in front of my then live-in GF. Fast forward a few years. He's been divorced twice before 22. I don't think his family even knew about the second marriage before it happened. One of my other cousins has at least 1, maybe 2, kids out of wedlock. Meanwhile, my wife and I have been happily married for 6 years. And together for 10. I was a virgin until 23 when I married my husband. I'm 30 now. We're now in the process of divorce and I have met someone else during the separation. I thought I would have a lot of guilt and shame hanging me up in the premarital sex area. But it actually turned out to be pretty liberating. Sex with my husband was traumatic and abusive at times and my new experiences have been much better. I will not be preaching abstinence to my children. My marriage of 5 years ended a month ago, divorce still pending. We were both virgins when we got married and sex ended up being a huge problem in our relationship. I honestly don't know what I will do in the future in regards to sex. I definitely will never be one to sleep around, but I'm not sure if I will be open to having sex with someone that I'm in a committed relationship with before being married. This stems from a Christian faith perspective for me. I have a little bit of a different story. I grew up in a Mormon household. So we, women especially, were always taught that sex was a bad dirty thing. Sex after marriage was just for procreation. And sex before marriage was right up there with murder. Anything sex related, masturbation, oral, etc. was a terrible sin that we'd have to confess to our bishop, who is always a man, in explicit detail. It was a very toxic and shameful environment. And I've since left, but my sex life is now ed. I dunno. I guess there is something about being threatened your entire life with eternal damnation that can really mess with your head. Luckily I found a great therapist who is really helping me rewire my feelings and fears around sex. I was not necessarily saving myself for marriage, but my now ex-wife and I dated for 7 years before having sex, and we married a year later. We divorced after 14 years of marriage. So far we have been divorced for 1 year. But separated for 2. Right now I can't even think of having sex with someone else. The few dates I've been on seem weird. I still have strong feelings for my ex. The divorce definitely was not a mutual want thing. I say all this to say this. Right now I want to say that I will not have sex outside of marriage. But it is easy to say that. I honestly don't know what my thoughts will be on the subject when I am ready. One of my best buddies is dating a girl who has had sex with several previous partners but is now saving herself for marriage because whatever that means once you've already had sex. She's a lunatic and he's like the sweetest dude ever. He came back to our city for a couple of days to visit the boys and she kept FaceTiming him to make sure he wasn't screwing around with girls or anything else. Like of the 72 hours he was here, he spent probably 18 hours FaceTiming her. If he didn't answer, just keep calling and calling and calling. He plans to marry this woman. I have a feeling he'll have a story that will fit this thread very well in the next year. This may apply to me. I wanted to save myself for marriage. Once I was engaged, my fiance registered sign convinced me that being engaged was close enough, so we did do the deed. It was very awkward and he had performance anxiety and got mad. Once we did get to actually having sex, it was a week later, after trying daily but failing. I bled on his mattress. He later claimed I wasn't a virgin and that I just so happened to have my period in that moment. Guy was a real ass in the end. Sex was very lame and boring with him. After almost 5 years of that, and physical abuse, and never actually getting married, thank God. I left and became very sexually active. I was insatiable. Not with too many people. I was always dating the person I had sex with. I hold no shame. Was in a straight marriage. Divorced only a year later when I discovered I was a lesbian. Despite my username. The only person I'd ever had sex with I married. I knew nothing about sex. He watched PRN and I didn't, so a lot of our sex life hinged upon that. Until I was ARPED and he said you weren't ARPED, you're just a, and that killed me. I spent 10 more years. Isn't an abusive parent a bitch? Never learned to say no to anyone. Married to him. When I finally left I started over. And now despite me feeling braggy I can say I am that phoenix. I've moved so far past the old me that no one who knew me then gets it. He spent this time calling me histrionic and you know what? I am a histrionic. The best kind. Never forget what you are. For surely the world will not. Make it your strength. Then it can never be your weakness. Honor yourself in it. And it will never be used to hurt you. Well, I was a 20-year-old Christian who saved herself for marriage. Thought I was gay. Pretty much confirmed it after having sex with a man. But stayed married for 10 years. Got divorced. Had sex with a woman. Very much confirmed it. Happily having gay unmarried heathen sex now. 10/10 would recommend having sex before marriage, especially if you think you might be gay. Waited for marriage. Married way too young. Divorced after 14 years, went a little crazy for a little while. I'm telling this without putting a judgment on it. I entertained the fantasy that I was going to sleep with a lot of people. I bought condoms and was, on some level, open to it. I started flirting with a co-worker who was a longtime friend. One night on a multi-day school field trip, we're both teachers and were chaperoning, we made out and had sex. We just got married last June. She's the only person I've ever had sex with besides my former wife. Who had sex during a field trip? A friend of mine saved herself for marriage. Got married in her early 20s. Literally cut their reception short so they could leave and go have sex. Then began their decade-long struggle with intimacy. She really wanted to have kids. But her husband seemed really disinterested in having sex. She tried everything she could think of. They went to couples counseling. Towards the end, they were averaging sex once a year. If that. One day, he revealed to her that he had been having an affair with a man for years. Her world was shattered. In a weird twist of fate, she ended up having rebound sex with one of her guy friends and she got pregnant. They tried to date while she was pregnant, but it just wasn't a match. They have a great co-parenting relationship though. She's let go of pretty much all her old conservative religious hang-ups, no longer hates the LGBTQ+ community and doesn't think people who get abortions are demons. etc. and is now happily remarried to a great guy that gives her the goods on the regular. Wow, I'm surprised I'm the only real answer here. I wanted to explore. And I did. A lot of it was about doing things and then being self-aware enough to know how I felt about it and if I wanted to do it again. I think in the end I've been more sexually active than most people I know. Tinder was a lot of fun for a while. I came out of that marriage with more confidence than I started it with, and that made me feel SI, which made me horny lol. I realized saving myself and being pure was sort of silly. Having sex with multiple people while I was single didn't and hasn't harmed my relationships since. In many ways it helped me know what I want and learn how to be vocal about it. Now 5+ years later I'm back to being monogamous and wanting to explore my sexuality with my current so instead of a bunch of people, but I'm still very open about a lot and also know where to draw the line. But I was definitely wild for a bit and had a blast. Not me, but an ex. His mother didn't have sex until marriage. Got divorced. Remarried. Divorced. A number of times. I honestly don't remember how many. 3 at the very least. Maybe 5. Maybe more by now. She wouldn't have sex until marriage for every single one of her relationships. Perhaps why she ended up getting married divorced so many times. I guess she felt it reset each time. Saved myself. Got married to my best friend. Had sex. Hated it. Like wow, holy what is the hype, it's terrible. And it wasn't just them. End up in s-less marriage. Got divorced. Had sex with lots of other people I befriended. Kinda fun just to see how they like it. It's pretty meh, I guess. It's about as exciting as eating. Went poly because marriage was a joke. Just now starting to think I'm a Zool. So the whole saving myself just feels like it was a convenient excuse for me to avoid sex for 25 years. Which makes a lot more sense. Lol. Bold of you to assume Redditors have sex. I want real answers, but the lack of a serious tag has me thinking I won't get M. So the Bible says that sex should be between a man and his wife. So if they are true to their logic, if it is coming from the Bible, they wouldn't have sex until they were married again. I'm not religious BTW, I just grew up Catholic and had this drilled into me. Over and over again. Your psychologist. Are you sure it was scripture that was drilled into you? Damn. You Americans are weird. I'm the opposite of what you're asking for. But as a writer, human psychology intrigues me no end. I've read that some people so internalize this no sex bad schema that when they are finally married, they can't do it. Can it enjoy it? Basically dumped headfirst into a world they have no knowledge of. Makes me sad for them. Actually. I didn't exactly save myself before marriage, however I lost my virginity to my high school sweetheart. We got married when he joined the military and at 19/20 I popped out 2 kids. Turns out he was physically abusive, so I left our marriage at 21. I'm now 26 and I went from only my husband to, well, my count is now older than I am. No regrets lol. That is a very targeted audience you're aiming for there. I needed to have sex with the other person to know that sex could feel good. It was always painful with my ex-husband. So the next person I was with, we had sex on our first date. And I knew this guy was the guy who was actually meant for me. So I had no reservations about it. Never got married, but my first relationship was supposed to be this, minus marriage, essentially just causes me to be more demisexual at the end of the day. As a demisexual who's only ever been with one person, I feel this. If my relationship ended, I don't think I'd ever be able to trust anyone enough to want sex again. An emotional bond requires trust. And without that, physical intimacy for me is a complete no-go. I saved myself for, not necessarily marriage, but a long time. I was brainwashed by my Christian upbringing. I lost my virginity in my 20s. There were 2 girlfriends of mine in high school whom I wanted pretty bad at the time but abstained. Then I reunited with each of them, spaced apart to FC, like 5 years later. And by then I had come to my senses. They ended up being my first 2 partners anyway. And I'm so glad I got that second chance. Did I regret saving myself for such a long time? Yes. But things worked out anyway. Honestly, I'm not promiscuous. But I tend to regret the ones I didn't sleep with more than the ones I did. I still kept with it. Outside of a few fleeting instances of bad lonely judgment and 1-year-long relationship. Post-divorce, a marriage of 9 years, I went through a crisis of identifying who I was. I learned that I don't respect the notion of loose dating or LTRs because, to me, it comes off as fickle commitment. I got remarried 2 years after the divorce and have been happily with my wife ever since. I waited until 6 months after I got engaged. And after our divorce 3 years later I slept with everyone I could. I was Mormon when I got married. And while still married, I'm no longer Mormon. If we ever get divorced, I'm having all the sex. Gay sex. Hookups. Booty calls. Not scary kinky. All of it. I will make up for all that lost time and all that pointless shame. Once it's out of my system, I'll be slightly more discerning.